Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining the Ryan Weiner podcast, where we explore everything that has to do with existence. If existence is something you're interested in figuring out why you're here, please hit that like button and subscribe so you can get more material like this. And it's the only way YouTube knows I'm around. So we appreciate it greatly. We have a very cool guest today. So this is a guest, and I'm sorry, Dr. Jennifer Bird, a PhD, who is a biblical and theological scholar and author of several books, including Permission Granted, Take the Bible into Your Own Hands, Marriage in the Bible, which is a whole interesting subject on its own right there. And then we're probably going to, maybe we'll talk about some other new and upcoming stuff. So yeah, Dr. Bird, if you want to take it from there, if you want to tell us a little your background, how did you get to where you are and your mission that you're trying to do?
My mission. I love that.
Yeah.
I usually introduce myself as saying I'm a biblical scholar and I care very much about what people do with what they find in the Bible. So that's my tagline. That's what I'm up to. I'm generally interested in harm reduction.
Mhm.
And that can play out in lots of different ways in terms of what people have been taught about that the Bible says and how they're upholding that and doing that is harmful to themselves, or doing that is harmful to the people in their relationships, or doing that means that they're not actually in tune with some of the things going on in the world around them, right? So there's a whole, as you well know, there's a whole range of ways that this can play out, in my opinion. So the quick version of how I got to this mission, I did grow up in a Christian family. I grew up in southwestern Virginia, relatively small town called Roanoke. And
I'm from
very,
Virginia.
yeah,
I used to live
yeah.
in Millboro, so
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so it's still kind of a segregated city,
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
and
It has
so
its own vibe.
it totally does. I grew up here. I love it, but I also I needed to get away, and coming back has been a shock actually to my system. So there are all kinds of elements there. It's a pretty conservative town, generally speaking. You get into the city, and there's a lot of progressive people. But so I grew up in a Christian family. The church was our social outlet, all that kind of stuff. You know, church on Sundays and sometimes Sunday nights again. Did things like the Appalachian Service Project as our summertime mission project. So we'd go help people rebuild their homes or build homes to begin
Mhm.
with to live in. And when I got into my teens, I got to a point where I wanted something a little bit more meaty that you could kind of sink your teeth into instead of kind of this really lovely kind of middle of the road love people kind of thing. And so I got involved in an evangelical organization called Young Life, and I was a volunteer all through college. I was on staff with them for first couple years out of college. It's a very conservative, almost fundamentalist way of reading the Bible is what was going on in that community. Not all Young Life people do, but most do. So I had a particular way of reading the Bible, right? That I changed my clothing, I changed my wardrobe when I was dating someone in college because I didn't want to cause him to stumble. So
Right.
I already dressed kind of loosely, and I bought even
I love
baggier
stumble
clothes,
in this. It's my favorite
kind
line.
of thing, right? Um, I took it very seriously. And so even though I had, for instance, women in my life who, we had female associate pastors, all kinds of really important, strong women in ministry in my life, when I kind of took this swing to the right theologically, none of that, all of that seemed wrong, because I believed the idea that, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a
Right.
man. And so the scriptures, trumping all these real life people's gifting. And so, kind of as most people do, it was a journey, right? We all have journeys. So I ended up, going to seminary because someone had showed me how attending to the Greek really closely in a particular passage. It's, if people are familiar, it's known as the Martha Mary passage. But
Mhm.
someone had shown me how you could interpret that honoring the Greek, not trying to make it say something, but looking at what the Greek is doing, that you could interpret it in essentially the flip side, the flip of the way I had been taught to interpret that. And so that it was such that Jesus was saying to Martha that Mary chose for herself instead of what she chose. right? So she decided to choose for herself. That's what Jesus is honoring, in contrast to Martha giving into social expectations of her, right?
Yeah, why isn't she
So,
taking care of the guests?
right, right. And, this being supposedly put in Jesus's mouth, saying that to me, like, Jen, choosing to do what you're good at is, I'm going to honor that, right? Like, this was mind blowing. Like, literally, I had like some sort of supernatural kind of, it felt like this fabric of the universe opened up and went back together differently. Like, it
Mhm.
truly, it was the biggest deal in my life. Like, it was a big
Yeah,
deal. I'm like, okay, if that can change just because someone's paying attention to the Greek, I want to go study Greek and Hebrew. I want to be able to translate those for myself, or at least to be in on the conversations about deciding what it says. So I went to seminary not with no clue what I was going to do with it. The Bible was really important to me. And so I went. And when you go to seminary, it's a 3-year program full time, right? And you're exposed to so many different ideas and 2000 years of history,
right.
in terms of
Yeah.
development of thought, all that. So I went in a very different person than I came out. In fact, I had people warn me that I might think my way out of my faith. Like, they tried to warn me not to
Hmm.
go to seminary. And I actually kind of agreed with them. Like, I was afraid that I might, but I also knew, or had a conviction, that I had to, right? I had to use it. It had to be okay to use my mind, right? And if there were challenges or questions that God or the Bible couldn't handle, then they weren't worth my devotion to begin with. So I needed to sort that out.
Yeah.
So I kind of backed into all this, like, higher education around biblical studies. And so when it came time to, wrapping up your 3 years, I'm like, what am I doing? I I'm an educator at heart, and I knew how important it was for me to encounter some of the information that I encountered at seminary. And I wanted to try to make it more accessible to people who couldn't get to seminary, right, but would like the insights. So that's why I went on for PhD, and here we are, almost 20 years later. Yeah, just kind of finding my way through things. So, the first 6 years out of graduate school, I had a full-time position at a school in Greensboro, North Carolina, called Greensboro College. And it was fantastic. I taught a lot. Like, I taught 3 dozen intro courses in 6 years, in addition to other things. So just a lot of content. I got really good at having the conversation with people in a wide range of beliefs, you know, how to approach the Bible from an academic perspective, how to honor where people are coming from who are more conservative, and kind of naming what they believe and perhaps some of the things that might be scary for them in what we're going to discuss, and then saying, hey, you don't have to agree with this, right? We're just going to talk about it, right? I just want you to consider.
We're in the
Um,
trust tree.
yeah, yes, okay, sure, sure, yeah. So anyway, I got really good at that, and I had so many students say to me, after class or whatever, Dr. Bird, the conversation we just had today, I really want my parents to hear it. I really wish I could have this conversation, but I'm not good at it. Like, I
Yeah.
can't do what you just did, but I want them to hear. So that was kind of why, when I was, a bunch of faculty were let go. They were trying to save the college, basically. Um, and so I went and I lived in a friend's basement for a year, and I
Mm.
just downloaded all of those really important conversations that I had with students, that did help them engage the Bible in a more informed way. But also, I kind of say sometimes, like, it's critical thinking meets reading the Bible.
Right.
And you don't have to, if you're a person of faith, you don't have to throw out your faith in order to do this. In fact, a lot of people find it empowering, because
Right.
they don't have to play around with making everything okay, right? You can just name that this is a problem,
The
and just say,
biblical
okay, this
diagnosis.
is a problem, and we don't do things like that anymore. Um,
Right.
so that was the permission granted. This one over here, and while I was in North Carolina, there they put up an amendment to the state constitution that would indirectly define marriage as between a man and a woman. And so, long story short, that issue and trying to have public conversations with people, like trying to have just normal, like, is what got me interested in trying to help people work through, like, the difference between what the Bible is actually talking about and what you think it's saying. And then also, like, the way they thought might not be the way we think anymore. And that isn't about being secular or anything. It's that we know more about human sexuality than they did. We know more about, biology. We know more about these things. We don't any longer tend to see women as just property of a man.
Right. Hopefully.
It does still play out sometimes, but not to the same degree, right? All those things, right? So this book, Marriage in the Bible, What Do the Texts Say, is my attempt to help people take an honest look at what's going on, and then what you're going to do with it from there is up to you, right? So it's for a general audience. So anyway, so that's what I'm up to with those two books, and yes, I do have one about Paul coming out probably next year. So
Okay, cool.
yeah.
Something you said that really struck me as funny, because I've heard this from multiple people that have taught or gone to seminary, is the amount of people that go in and then come out like atheists, basically. Why is
Yeah.
that exactly? Is it just people here that like, oh, I thought Matthew was written by Matthew and it was written by, then they find out it has five authors and we don't know who the authors were. And it's all, and then, or they'll read the interlinear version and then compare it to like, a Greek to English interlinear, then try to compare that to something like the King James. And this isn't, I've been lied to my whole life. Is that kind of what happens for these guys?
Well, Ryan, you've raised a really important issue, and I'm hedging a little bit here because I responded to that differently than someone like Bart Ehrman did.
Hmm.
And part of the reason for that is I took a lot of feminist I took like a feminist womanist theology course, and I read feminist biblical scholars, and I'm informed by all of them. And he did not. He didn't focus on the theology when he was in seminary. He focused on biblical texts, and his PhD focused on biblical texts. So he's not actually well trained as a theologian, just to be honest. So so when he talks about being an atheist, he's dealing with a different framework than I'm going to use. And because there is a book still in me that after Paul, redefining God. Part of the problem is if when people say, "Are you an atheist?" My question is always, "Well, what is the God
Yeah.
that you're asking me if I
What's your
believe in?"
definition of God?
Right, right. How
Yeah.
do you describe that God, right? And most of the time, people who want to use this label at all, like people who aren't atheists who use the label atheist, what they're doing is they're thinking of the way God is described in the Bible. And do I believe in that God? And hell
Right.
no, I do not. And I don't think anyone should.
Yeah.
But most people aren't given time and space to sit down and sort it all out so that they come out on the other side with something that's still helpful for them.
Hmm.
Most people say, when they encounter this new perspective, it's like this slippery slope and they just trash everything to do with like, nope, if this isn't it, then none of it's true
Right.
and I'm an atheist. And I don't think that's actually very honest, or I don't think it's as rigorous as it could be. So I usually call myself a humanist. I don't like using the label to do with theism at all.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Because I think that the concept, like I think there's a category or a concept of God that we could still hold on to in the 21st century, and it would be useful. But I have lots of dear colleagues, right, who call themselves atheists, and I'm like, well, you just don't affirm the thing that's described in the Bible, right? But that's not necessarily the same thing
Hmm.
as
Yeah.
saying I don't think there's a thing such as God. So anyway, you got my point. But
Yeah.
it's because people aren't given a lot of support to define any of it differently, right?
Yeah.
That it's all or nothing, just like they were when they were conservative. It's all or nothing, right? Like
Yeah.
there's more nuance here because life is nuanced, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
anyway. So that's. I'm sorry if I'm kind of rambling with each
No, no,
response here, but I just
no, that's
it's
absolutely
it's
perfect.
interesting stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think the same thing. I think what I've seen, friends I have who went from one thing to the other, this sort of absolutism, it's this book, this library of books is inerrant. I love biblical inerrancy. It's my other favorite thing people preach. Biblically inerrant, even though things don't correlate or make sense or reconcile with each other, we just don't pay attention to it. They get that for such a long time. and then they get like the different stuff in there about this wasn't written by this person, and again they find, well, this one thing isn't true, so now I don't know if anything has been true. And it's almost like kind of a rejection almost of the person that taught them that stuff too. They don't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah,
And so
that's right.
I've said this to me before, and they said, well, I'm very into physics and very into quantum mechanics and science and everything. And from the
Uh-huh.
way I talk about stuff, people find it very hard to do. You didn't seem like a theist or anybody to me. And I said, well, yeah, because my definition is different than yours.
Right.
I don't
Right.
believe in a guy who in the Old Testament picks up your soul like a bowling ball, throws it down the alleyway and says, okay, go to earth. And if you screw anything up, you're going to hell for a lake of eternity and fire, which doesn't even exist in the Bible. There's no lake of fire. It does. It's again, that's men extrapolating on something and explaining to us what we are supposed to think. But yeah, I see that sort of thing happening to people, and that was one of the things that kind of inspired me to just start giving people little bits of information like this, like we're doing today, to be like, look, you can go out and read books for yourself. Nobody's going to get. There's no God that's going to get mad at you because you went and read a philosophical book, questioning something else.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and just other things that just kind of go along with that there. But
Mhm.
um, do you want to talk? Do you want to talk about the Paul material? Because the thing I was going to ask about the marriage in the Bible,
Okay.
this was my lead into it, and this comes from something else. So Paul is an oddity for anybody who doesn't know this, in the fact that he's sort of, oh, very nice. There we go. Excellent. Kind of an oddity in the fact that, in the Old Testament, we are supposed to go forth and multiply, yet his instructions is not to even get married unless you feel a burning desire to do so. And even been compared to sort of having a Gnostic stance on the entire idea of that. And I know there's some other things that was Paul a self-hating,
Mhm.
was he gay or, people have brought this up before. Again, we're just talking about it.
Mhm.
But what are your thoughts on him as a character and with the book and everything where that's going? However you want to go for that.
Yeah, well, it is, it's a really, I think, what I wish is for every Christian who is concerned about homosexuality, I wish they would read chapter 7 of my book
Mhm.
because what you just pointed out, Ryan, right? Paul Paul makes it sound like marriage is like a last ditch effort to keep yourself in control, right? Like he says he'd prefer that people not be married. He'd prefer that people be like who he is, which is single. I don't know if that means abstinent. It probably did for him, but he is anti-marriage. But again, as you pointed out, this burning issue, it's about passion, and passions are bad for
Right.
Paul. And that's why people compare him to, or ask if he's kind of been in conversation with some of the philosophical movements who also kind of reflect that the bodily passions and desires are bad, and you need to be so self-disciplined to keep them under control. And if
Mm.
you can't control it yourself, then you can get married in order to release that. Like it's not in order to enjoy,
Right.
as my friends and I thought of it in college. No, no. So yes, you're right. Paul is kind of anti-marriage. Jesus is very different, right? So Jesus is depicted being fine with levirate marriage, like
What kind of marriage?
levirate marriage, the scenario
Between.
where a man takes a woman and she's his, but he dies before giving her children, before she has children with him. So his brother, the next in line, has to do the duty of the brother-in-law and go in and have sex with her. And if they have children, then those children belong to the first son in terms of inheritance and all that stuff.
Mm.
But there's a scenario that's posed to Jesus in one of the Gospels where Pharisees come up to him and say, "Hey, this woman was married to 7 brothers. So which one does she belong in heaven?" And Jesus' response, as depicted in the Gospel, is not, "Well, first of all, I think we should do away with this practice."
Right.
Like
Right.
he's totally comfortable with the concept of a woman being forced to have being given to 7 different brothers, right? Not ideal, right? Um, and then second, he's like, well, in heaven we don't give her in marriage and yada yada yada. So he's okay with like a really objectifying practice for women in terms of marriage. He also reflects very much the Hebrew Bible ideas about this pairing up relationship. We call it marriage. The biblical texts aren't as clear about defining things as marriage the way we think of it.
Yeah.
None of the biblical texts, whether either testament, has a label to differentiate a woman who is single and a woman who has been paired up. Same for the man. There is not a noun to differentiate a man from his role as a husband, right?
Mhm.
There isn't a noun for it in the Greek or the Hebrew. So we should, I
Yeah.
think, remove all language, right, about marital status language from both testaments. But anyway, back to Jesus, right? So in the Hebrew Bible, which is how I refer to the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, women are very clearly property of men, right? A man takes a woman, takes her home, has sex with her, essentially marks his territory, and now everybody knows that she's his, right? And so Jesus's comments about marriage or divorce in the Gospels very much perpetuate those women are property ideas.
Mhm.
So you have Jesus saying women are property, Paul saying marriage is actually a distraction, not a good idea, right? Like, and then Jesus also, in the same passage where they're asking him about for which reason he's okay with divorce, at the end of that is when he throws down that eunuch gauntlet and says, and by the way, not everyone can handle this, but whoever can should make yourself a eunuch for the kingdom, which directly
Right.
contradicts the concept of being fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So, like, they're not consistent, right? These two important guys
Yeah.
don't agree with each other. Let's just, let's be honest about this, So,
Yeah, it's a very strange area with the entire discussion of it. People don't know that, like, what a eunuch was, or there were actually guys who used to castrate themselves or have that done because they could have places in royal court, so to speak, without other men having to worry about them doing anything with their women, so to speak. That's
no,
kind of
no.
okay.
The issue was impregnation, not
Yes,
about
yeah,
sexual intercourse. There's a
yeah,
difference, right? They could potentially still be getting busy with
right,
them, but it's about procreation. Yeah.
yeah,
And the early church, because of that passage in Matthew 19, verse 12, where Jesus basically says, not everybody can handle this, but whoever can should do it. Because of that command, the men in the early church, first almost 300 years, were castrating themselves for the sake of the kingdom. And it was such an important issue. It was so upsetting for whatever reasons to men in power, that the very first council that was called ecumenical council, as they're referred to, in 325, right? Constantine said, I don't want our theological differences to split my empire. So you guys get together and sort this stuff out, right?
is that Nicaea?
The emperor caused the first ecumenical council to take place.
Yeah,
And the very first, they had like 20 different things that they were stating in this as a result of their collaboration and conversation or whatever. The very first thing they said is, if you have castrated yourself for the sake of the kingdom, you are not allowed to be a leader of the church. It was important enough.
right, yeah,
At the first, I mean, yeah, people were reading that passage in Matthew and taking it very literally, right?
yeah,
Yeah. So marriage, like, what is, when people talk about marriage in the Bible, like, they usually think it means, okay, it needs to be procreative from Genesis 1:28, procreate, be fruitful and multiply. Well, and then it also can only be sex in marriage, right? So people misunderstand what Genesis 2:24 says when it says, therefore a man will leave his father and mother, cling to his woman, and the two become one flesh. And so people are taught that is that is saying no sex before marriage. This one in Matthew 19, people misunderstand, they read the premise that's being posed as Jesus' final claim, and that's not the case. He's actually building up to the eunuch claim. And then this Ephesians 5 passage, 31 and 32, that makes it something sacred, that makes marriage between a man and a woman sacred because it's compared to Jesus and the church. Very powerful language, right? But people misunderstand, right? Because Genesis 1:28 says, yeah, be fruitful, multiply. But in Genesis 1:22, God says the same thing to the fish in the sea and the birds of the air. Like,
right,
he's not telling them to get married, but he's telling them to be fruitful. And so over the centuries, and it started quite early, that Jewish men were reading Genesis 1 and 2 through this lens of it being marriage, when what's being talked about is something other than the human institution of marriage. Genesis 2 is, you can see from the outset, it's about the first human is it's not good that the first human is alone.
Right.
Well, the first human isn't actually male. The first human is just a generic human,
Right.
and God looks and says it's not good that this one's alone. So let's get it a partner, right? An equal, a partner as its
Oh,
equal. Yeah, not a helpmeet, but a partner as its
yeah.
equal who sees it face to face, right? And so at the end, he brings all the animals through, and fortunately, none of those work. And at the end, now we have two. One is split into two, and so now we have man and woman, male and female. And therefore, this is the thing that people have this desire to partner up. That there's this, for most people, obviously not everyone, but that there's a general human desire or longing for partnership and to not be alone. That is, to me, a very different claim or issue to be focusing on than to say God is ordaining marriage to be between a man and a woman, right? Because there's no marriage language there. There's no marrying happening. We don't have marrying labels. We don't have husband, wife. It's just man, woman. And so if you can let go of all the kind of preconceived notions about what these texts are saying and what their intent
Exactly.
is, the intent is to talk about partnering up and starting your own families. We put onto it this issue or structure of this is about marriage. And, I don't think it's fair because of how differently they were thinking about and talking about these relationships than we do when we talk about marriage. So, yeah, I mean, I just think the texts are really much more interesting, actually, than what people tend to say that they are. And I think I've really strayed from whatever question you asked me that set me down
I'm not
down this
sure.
road
This
of
all
this
just no. I
conversation.
I do the same thing. Like I'm talking about something, and then something pops it. So it goes. Yeah. It always comes full circle at some point
Kind of
there. But
flows, but
yeah, I was one of the things that I has been something I've noticed since the time I was a kid. From kind of what I told you about something there, and then seeing people in different positions of the clergy. It never fails. There's a job position open called narcissistic person who thinks he can speak for God. That position is always open, and there's always people applying for that job. The
it's
here's
a
oh this
fascinating.
says this, here's what it means, and I know
Mhm,
this, and anybody who
mhm.
disagrees with me is incorrect. No,
Uh-huh,
sorry. I mean, are you auditorily hearing somebody talking to you right now?
right.
Because that could be a whole different issue. um
Hmm.
but yeah, you having a feeling about something or you had a dream about it, I'm sorry, we all have dreams and feelings too. So just
Yeah,
because you're going to be aggressive about it doesn't make you correct. It just But that's it. That's what it is.
yes,
It's we get this in politics. That's
that's
I work in politics too, and the thing is, the loudest, most aggressive on the
yeah,
right or the left is who gets
that's
on
right.
TV, and that
That's
sets
right.
the tone and the pace for everybody
That's right.
else because no one wants to deal with that guy. No
That's
one.
right.
I'll just let him stand up there and say what he wants to. I'll go home and do something different.
Exactly, Ryan. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so the Paul book is really about trying to help people see that in Paul's letters over and over and over and over again. Look at how many times he is asserting his idea as right, right? All the different elements of the typical narcissistic traits, right?
Mm,
I don't ever call him a narcissist. I say that he has narcissistic tendencies, and we can
right.
see, right, his arrogance or his dismissal, his very rude dismissal of people and mischaracterization of other people for the sake of making a point, and all kinds of and the dualistic thinking that he operates out of and then perpetuates, and how that is really, dualistic thinking is helpful for getting groundwork. It's helpful for setting ethics, it's helpful for children. And
Mm,
then when you hit teenage years, we all need to start seeing the nuance, right?
right.
And Paul's letters are consistently dualistic, all or nothing. Instead of someone lies, he calls a person a liar, right? And so the essentialization that happens when you do that then means that you can think negatively about the person as a whole instead of realizing that's just one part of who they are.
Right. Right.
And we see that playing out around us. And when we see people doing that in political discussions or whatever, like kind of just all or nothing again.
Yeah. You changed your mind on something. Now you're a flip-flopper. No, I read some new scientific information and
Right.
now I'm more informed than I was before, man.
That's right. That's right. So, the categories that I'm engaging for the Paul book, at least in one part, is this, the manipulative language that he uses, right? I mean, it's manipulative, just baseline to say that someone died for you and you should be grateful,
Yeah,
right? Um,
yeah,
and all of the language that says, that suffering, that God suffered for you so that whatever, like that is emotionally manipulative.
yeah,
And he does it all the time. I know you know this, but like he does it all the time in these letters, just kind of drops a little comment or whatever, and it's like a side, it's like a glance, like I'm watching you, or the letter Philemon is fascinating to me because of this, right? Like
mm,
it's not clear what he's actually trying to get, which is unusual for Paul. He's not direct. And he's got this whole thing like, I could tell you what to do, but I'm not going to. And by the way, prepare a room for me to come visit. Like that's kind of intimidating and scary,
right. Yeah,
unless he actually is writing this to a lover who he can't wait to see. And then there's
right,
very different, but it's still not what people think of Paul
right.
being.
Yeah,
So many fascinating, so there's manipulative language, there's narcissistic tendencies, there's, which is arrogance and all that kind of stuff, dismissal, of believing in a wrathful God. Like Paul's letters and Paul, the comments reflect the belief that God is actually quite wrathful. He talks about people being spared from the wrath of God. I mean, this is, so anyway, so the aside from just the basic, the real kind of familiar, God is, Paul is a little bit patriarchal or whatever. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of people today who are more misogynistic than they realize. Like that's a
yeah,
thing
yeah,
that's still very real. So I'm not even interested in that so much. Like,
yeah.
let's look at these other things. He was okay with enslavement. Let's talk about what that means. Let's talk
Right.
about how that plays out in his letters, and therefore why people today are having a hard time understanding this issue. Anyway, so all of those things are at play in my before reading Paul's letters, read this book, which is the next one I'm working on.
Yeah, that's perfect. I'm going to go through and do that again. I'll definitely be reading it first. Let me ask you a question. This will just kind of be an off the hook here. So yesterday I happened to be watching a particular guy's an ex-pastor. Cannot remember his name, but he had an entire 30 minutes on how the apostles never existed.
Mm.
And his thing to this was that, these guys are only mentioned in these very sparingly ways that's in the New Testament. And then we hear like nothing until we read different acts kind of down
Uh,
there. And it's okay, so here's how this guy died, here's how this guy died, here's how this guy died, here's how this guy died. Nobody would have died for any, if they did exist and then had died, nobody would have died for false reasons. Nobody would do, no, people do that all the time, man. That's. But
yeah.
what is your opinion, in the way of Paul and the different characters in the Bible? Do you have an idea on which ones you think sort of existed and which didn't, or which are historically, like there was a guy named Jesus who walked around at that time. Historically, Josephus will say so maybe or something. But what was that person's character? Who were they really? But what are your
Uh,
thoughts on the different characters in the New Testament and everything?
yeah. So I will be honest and say I haven't spent a lot of time with the various ancient texts.
Mhm.
Um, what I operate out of or with is a general sense of what I'm seeing in the Gospels, and those are the four canonized ones. And I am very much aware of the non-canonized Gospels. Okay, but just looking at the four in the canon,
Mhm.
we either have someone who's schizophrenic, right? Or sorry, that's not the proper word anymore. I'm so sorry. I multiple personality. Like we either have someone. I need to figure out the right terminology here, but we have
Okay.
someone who is not sound of mind if all of these are true, and it's not possible, right?
Right.
So I look at it in terms of, yeah, there's probably a guy named Jesus in the Galilean area in the early first century who got really fed up with the exploitation of the people, just like the ancient prophets in the Hebrew Bible did,
Right.
whether or not they are people we can pin down, right?
Right.
I'm not as interested in saying anymore in saying that this is that this guy existed, because it's kind of like talking about God. Like, how are you describing this guy Jesus that you want me to believe existed? Like, there was probably a person, right, who led some, some rallies,
Yeah.
right? Decrying the exploitation of the masses, right? That's entirely conceivable. There were plenty of Jews who were executed in the same way that Jesus was, right? So before him and after. So like, I don't, I don't know what to think about. There's a guy named Jesus who did these things. I think that it's reasonable to say there's a guy who did some of these things. But we look at accounts of other messiahs at the time and other sons of God, other men, blah blah blah. There's a lot of overlap, right, in
Yeah.
terms of what's being attributed to these other people. So, as a biblical scholar, I'm more interested in inviting people to consider that what's going on in these gospels is there's a lot of things being made up in order to depict something, in order to make a claim, in order to do something in particular, and to be able to say these are four different depictions, these are four different kind of essences, and to be okay with that instead of trying to see it as historically accurate.
Right.
So that there's a guy I'll pin to, and he does some things. And interesting that salvation in Luke is very different than salvation in John. Those both exist. I'm fond of the one in Luke for the most part because it's about fixing things in this world, right? And it's not
Yeah.
about heaven. So then the same is true for Paul. And it's interesting to me that before we started recording, that you talked about this, whether about the apostles or Paul, or it doesn't matter. You know, again, I don't have an interest to try to figure out if there was a guy named Paul, because what I care about is the aftermath. I care about the fact that there are letters attributed to a guy named Paul. And I happen to think that the genuine letters of Paul and the ones, whatever, if we can, there's 7 in one group and 6 in another, but there are 13 in there, all attributed to Paul. Like, what I care about is the fact that there's a collection in there and people trust it with their lives, and they use it to model how they think and believe and talk and treat each other. That's what I care about. And that there is some in there that's really helpful and good. Not a whole lot though, because there's a lot that's kind of has this
Sure.
burden of being an ancient text coming out of a patriarchal framework.
Mhm.
All the things we just talked about, right?
Yeah.
His narcissistic tendencies, he's okay with enslavement. All of these things are part of the way he sets an example, or whoever wrote those sets an example. They contradict each other, on certain topics. So I care that there are people today who do get power and authority by saying, this is what Paul meant. This is what the letter to the Romans means. That's what I care about. And so people, not just in churches, but it's a thing in academic settings, right? Just
Absolutely.
being able to say what Paul meant is powerful, right? So that's where I go. What are people doing with what they find in the Bible, right?
Yeah. What do you? This is kind of might be kind of an odd question here, but it's just I ask this. What do you think? What do people think the Bible is versus what they should see it as? If that makes sense.
Hmm.
What is it
Hmm.
really, and what was it meant to be? What were these guys trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So I think that, let's acknowledge that people tend to say that the Bible is the Word of God, right?
Yeah.
And then even that, what do people mean by that?
Yeah.
Within Christian contexts will vary. I think it varies even within different Jewish contexts and synagogues, temples. Like there's a wide range of what that means in terms of to what extent is it inspired generally? Is it the actual dictation of God?
Right.
Through these people, through these writers. In both faith communities, you'll find
Oh
the
yeah. Yeah.
spectrum, right? So I think for me in seminary, the biggest shift, and the one that I continue to try to invite my students to consider, is the shift from thinking of it as what God intended to what humans needed,
Mhm.
right? So that changes what you see and what you expect to find, and therefore how you're going to handle it when you see it, when you figure out what's going on, right? I teach an intro to the Hebrew Bible 4 times a year online, and invariably there'll be people who have no religious background, and then there'll be someone who wants to talk about Jesus the whole time, even though Jesus isn't in the Old Testament.
Right.
I
Yeah.
get it, right? And these over here are really hard to. It's really hard to get them to just consider that what we're seeing in these flood stories tells us more about the people and what the people needed a story to explain than it does anything about who or what God is, right? So that when you see that God is disappointed with the humans he created, it's okay because what we're doing is something else. We're not trying to actually talk about God. We're trying to present a story that's going to explain something for us, right?
Yeah.
That's a hard shift to make. It really, and I get it, but I think that's the most helpful first step, right? And so your question about what is it that these guys were trying to do, and there probably were a handful of women involved in the writing somewhere sprinkled throughout, but I think that they had different goals at different times for the various books. Why did I mean several of the books almost didn't make the canons. Like the book Song of Songs almost didn't make the Hebrew Bible canon because it's soft erotica. The book of Revelation almost didn't make the canon, right?
I don't think it did until it was like 500 years or something, wasn't it? It was put in. It was put in. I thought it took till like the year 475 for it to be counted for
Not to
Revelation.
my knowledge.
Okay.
It is on the list that Athanasius and his
Okay.
buddies created at
I don't know
at
where I
the
got
end of the
that
fourth
from. Okay.
century, 367-ish. But
Yeah.
but there was a conversation about whether it should be included, and that for good reasons actually, right? Because it's saying down with the empire. Anyway, so I think that different, very different intentions. Very, the books of Joshua and Judges are about defining a people called the Israelites
Right.
and who their God is just mighty and you ought to get on board with it, which is very different from what we see in the book of Exodus is similar to that, but like they're doing something about creating this origin story or this ancestry that has there is absolutely no way to tie any of it to reality, right? But
Yeah.
and they worked well because people to this day are defending them as actually historically accurate, right? That this
Yeah.
conquering of this piece of land, blah blah blah. So right, I think it was about that. It was about creating identity, creating people, creating this commitment, this us and our God kind of a thing. But then the prophets are doing something different, right? So the writers or the people who pass down those frustrations or those comments and then write it out as if it was actually the prophet speaking as if they're God. Like they're creating something. They're doing something there that's important. They're speaking out about the exploitation of the people by their own leaders. Like there's a reason that people today still like the prophets because it resonates. That's an important issue still. And that's very different from saying, who cares about this world? Just try to make sure you make it to the next. Like those
Yeah.
are different. So it's not what people are usually taught, right? There's poetry, there's epic, there's
Yeah. Yeah. I think, a lot of the different people out there that experience, they're really looking for like what I just call like a safety blanket. A lot of times they're looking for, I just need to be told that if I go to this place on every Sunday, I'm going to be completely fine, and that's my reassurance is there. But you don't rarely do you see people a lot of times that are very interested in that actually knowing any of the history of anything that where do these different things come from, here's what we teach now, but why did we teach something different 200 years ago about that exact same passage? So you're sort of just handed this information depending on what time you're born, what year you're born in. You're handed a bunch of information and here's how it is, and don't ask questions. And we've been so socially ingrained with that for 2,000 years, basically, or 1,977 years. There we go. So for that long, you've had this sort of like just getting, been handed a tray of food basically and been told that's your only choice. And I think right now people are finally starting to wake up to that. it just popped into my head maybe 2, 3 days ago. A particular rabbi, and I forget what his name is now, was speaking to somebody about how the Old Testament is seen as opposed to how it used to be seen, and in the Orthodox versus Hasidic, all these kind of different ways. And he was just kind of talking about the fact that he said, in our world, he basically just said that he's like, there's not a lot of people who really think that 2 million Jews left Egypt in the Exodus. Maybe it was 2,000, something along those lines. What's an amount of people that could survive traveling around in the desert and sustain themselves? So, and that's what he was admitting that he said, this is we're not, you don't hear people talking about the earth being 6,000 years old anymore. There's a small group of people who still
Yeah,
believe
I was
that.
like, yeah, you
There are
do.
people who still do, but it's not the mass majority anymore. And I think that's the shift that has taken place, is that you're not bonded to these different ideas and concepts by who, your family's beliefs. You're allowed to believe different things these days. You don't have somebody coming to your house and wanting to know why you weren't in service on Sunday, and why don't well, now you've made a terrible sin or something like that. So I see like a lot of hope in people kind of moving towards this open critical analysis that you were talking about, of being able to look at something and just say, okay, let's examine this without the fear of somebody godlike in the Old Testament getting mad at us because we question something somebody said, and let's just keep our mouths shut and do that. But yeah, it gives me a lot of hope. And honestly, and the different works people like yourself, authors, are doing, professors, teachers, everybody that are kind of giving people the opportunity, and like in your book, permission granted. You have permission to question these things and think about them for yourself. Well, I will do this here.
Important.
I want to be respectful of your time. So do you have anything else that you wanted to talk about, or?
I'm good. I'm good. I think there, like you said before, there's a lot we could keep going for
Yeah,
quite
for
some
a
time.
long time.
Um, yeah, yeah. I would like to say that if you're interested in seeing more about me, or I have a whole bunch of content on my website on my
Yes,
website,
go and check that out. That
which is
information,
my full
obviously,
name,
I'm going to put that in there and
jennifergraceberg.com. Yeah,
everything. Yeah,
yeah,
perfect, awesome.
yep.
Well, Dr. Bird, thank you so much for coming on today. I really greatly appreciate it. I hopefully when as soon as that Paul book is out, I would love to have you back on to talk specifically about that and go over it, and other different stuff going on.
Thank you.
So yeah, absolutely. So thank you guys, everybody, for joining us today. Like I said, please, if this is stuff that interests you, or you wouldn't be here anymore at this point in the call, probably, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so everybody keeps getting the information. And Dr. Bird, thank you so much again, and we will talk to you later.
All right. Thanks for having me.